Before we get started, I have a quick favor. I've been self-funding the Finding Genius podcast for 5 years now. I've done over 3,000 episodes. And as you can see on YouTube, we're up over 1 million views on the channel, which is fantastic. The next thing I really want to push on is to get up to 10,000 subscribers. Because once we do, we'll be able to put a donate button and we'll be able to solicit donations to help keep the podcast running and to also get the Finding Genius Foundation moving along. We have a big project studying anxiety, depression, and PTSD and working on a product to help people overcome these problems because I've seen them explode recently after the last 2 years of the whole virus situation. So if you would, please subscribe to the podcast. That would help us tremendously. Give us a thumbs up and check in the description for Buy Me a Coffee. It's about $5. If you could buy me a coffee, I'd really appreciate it. It would help keep the channel going, and I love coffee. Thank you.
Hi folks, this is Dr. Jacob Kendall. I do speaking and workshops on using four-dimensional thinking and demystifying healthcare, which you can learn about on my website, jacobevanskendall.com. I'm also founder of my business, The Versatile Social Worker, and I'm 2-0 versus open heart surgery. My personal experience in navigating the complex medical system in the U.S. intersects with my formal training in public health gerontology and social work. And through this, I show how we should use a multiple lens framework to thoroughly tackle any issue, including healthcare. Tune in. I share some great examples.
Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius podcast. My guest is Jacob Kendall. He's the founder of Kendall Enterprises. And we're going to talk about a very unusual topic, four-dimensional thinking. So I think this will be very interesting, and we'll see how Dr. Kendall has incorporated this into his work with his patients and caregivers. So we'll get into that shortly. So welcome, Jacob.
Yeah, thanks very much, Richard. I appreciate the opportunity to come on here.
Well, tell me a bit about your background, and then what is this four-dimensional thinking about?
Yeah, for sure. So I can start to answer both questions because what I typically say when it comes to my background is that there are two sets of, we'll call them variables, that are more definitional for me than anything else. One on the personal side, which also affects my professional pursuits, is that I have lifelong experience with managing my own complex medical care. I've had 2 open heart surgeries, diagnosed with a congenital disorder at age 3, and I have various other issues for which I seek specialists. And I'll go ahead and give a little bit of a spoiler alert. The framework that I typically use to explain four-dimensional thinking is health and healthcare. So that is the path that I will plan on going down. But anyway, on the personal side, I'm just, at some point, push became shove, and now I'm shoving back. I think there are a lot of issues with our health and healthcare system. I've just gotten tired of the BS, and I know that other people who have chronic diseases have resonance with when I have conversations with them and whatnot. So that's on the personal side of things. On the professional side of things, I have a truly interdisciplinary training, and that's what I like. I much prefer to be an expert of all, a jack of all trades rather than an expert of one. Ever since I was a child, I wanted to be a true Renaissance person. And so I think that I have degrees in biology, social work, public health, and gerontology. I'm currently studying some theology, but my PhD in gerontology is kind of the best example of what I mean. Technically, it is a PhD in interdisciplinary aging studies. That's a lot of syllables, so I just say gerontology. But their whole thing is when you come out of this program, you're going to have the skill of facilitating dialogue across very disparate disciplines. And I'm not just talking about molecular and cellular biologists working with one another. I mean, we study aging from the perspective of history and the humanities and law and ethics and sociology and demography and genetics and cognitive neuroscience. And that's how I prefer it. And that's also been very influential in kind of developing what I mean when I say the four-dimensional thinking. So that's a little bit of background.
Okay. You know what they say about studying aging, the old joke, if it gets old.
Yes, indeed.
So is four-dimensional thinking just a multidisciplinary approach, or what is it beyond,
the brief description you gave. Like, what is it? How do you define it? Yeah, I think that the multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary approach is one of the dimensions. And quite frankly, I think multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, whenever that has the root word disciplinary, is largely for academia. And I'm just going to be honest with you, man, I've been trying to come up with a term that applies outside of academia. That's where I was raised, and I was a professor for several years. And so I would love a term that applies, in other sectors as well. But for now, that one seems to work okay. And so that's one of the dimensions. What if we view a problem from the perspective of medicine, and then we view the same problem from the perspective of epidemiology, and then the same problem from the perspective of anthropology, et cetera? That's one of the dimensions. And that certainly is how I was thinking earlier in my training. I've just since kind of expanded beyond that. I don't even think it's me inventing anything. I think it's me making observations about how we think. Anyway, I just don't think we realize that we think that way, if that makes sense. Well, there's an acronym one teacher told me about called SPICE. You analyze along social lines, political lines, interactions between humans and the environment, cultural and economic. So maybe that's similar to what you're talking about. For the one dimension, yeah, for sure. And so to give an example of where I see some frustration here at the very macro level is, from what I read, our government in the U.S. hires a lot of political scientists and a lot of economists to help them do government and make policy. And that's great. I mean, political scientists and economists have some great insights. So something that really frustrates me about the fact that our government hires so many economists and political scientists is that I think that they're neglecting other kinds of perspectives. I was trained in my PhD program by a demographer and also by epidemiologists. And so I think that we don't use those perspectives as much. And even having everyday conversations with people, we can go back to the pandemic, right? And so many of the questions about what kind of decisions we should make about the pandemic always went back to, well, how's it affecting our economy? I'm like, why are we not asking demographically based questions and all these other kinds of questions as well? And I think that we need to be asking more of those. So that's just an example of kind of, basically it's that. It's an example of to explain why I've become frustrated about only thinking from a certain point. Does that make sense? And again, we're still only on one dimension right now. Well, I see it in some podcasts. Someone's a specialist in X, and are asking questions. They'll say, "Oh, I'm not an expert in Y. Oh, I can't speak to that because I'm not an expert in Z." So people are afraid. I think they're trained that way. You become an expert and get a degree in X, therefore you're allowed to think about X, but not Y, not Z, not anything else. And so I think people get pigeonholed like that. Yeah, they do. And coming from academia, which is incredibly siloed, and I think I want to be very clear here. Not everyone should be an interdisciplinarian. We need those people who know a particular topic from a particular disciplinary perspective down to their bone marrow. We need those people, but in the very least, we should recognize that the other perspectives exist, because I guess I can mention one of them. I really don't want to cast aspersions. I'm just offered some critical feedback. I don't know if you've heard of Aubrey de Grey, his book, Ending Aging. Okay, excellent. So as a gerontologist, obviously I'm going to be interested in these like anti-mortality movements. And I mean, I can tell you from a very kind of surface level perspective that the different things that he says that we need biologically, if we're going to theoretically attain mortality, are true. But I'm just really surprised at the fact that he doesn't even bother mentioning what would be the social implications of this. What would be the demographic implication? It doesn't even cross his mind. It doesn't seem to, that these are going to be extensive technologies, so only really wealthy people probably can afford this, which I think is something that Noah Yuval Harari goes into in Homo Deus. I don't want Aubrey de Grey and these other people to talk like they're experts on those issues, but at least acknowledge, like, hey, these other issues exist. I would love for someone else to speak to that kind of thing. And I guess I just don't see enough of that. Does that make sense? I agree. The audience of a lot of those people are these, biohackers, people that want to, live their best life, have great health and all that. I don't know if they would care about the other issues, because it's more of a selfish thing at that point. How can I, with 100 and great health, I'm not worried about anybody else. I'm worried about myself, is what I think the thinking would be. Not to say they're selfish, but I think that's how the books are written, to deliberately attract a certain audience. I don't know a lot of people that are, it's sad to say, I just don't think they're going to care about all the aspects of it. Some people will, yes. But I just don't think in one person, they might not even appreciate all this. That's my feeling, But I see this because, I speak to a lot of people, and I run into a phenomenon pretty often. They either can't answer, won't answer, don't have the capacity to answer, don't want to answer, whatever it may be. But a lot of the things I ask, I can't get answers to, because I think the people they don't want to engage, or they can't, or they fear engaging. Yeah, for sure. And to go to your first point, I definitely agree. And I've talked with some of these people, anti-aging, or I forget the name of the movement, but basically it's the ilk of Aubrey de Grey, where they're like, I'm just not interested in dying. And I agree with you. It's very individualistic. I don't know if selfish is the right word, but I would still argue that at least caring to some degree about the more macro perspective, which, by the way, is the second dimension, like how are they anticipating all of this getting to them? Because it's going to have to come through either policy or something at a higher level. The dominoes have to fall for it to trickle down to you. It's not just enough to think, oh, when this technology is invented or whatever, I'm going to have immediate access to it. That's a pipe dream.
I just don't think people think this way. Like, I've interviewed a bunch of people that are, into climate. Oh, we're all going to die and all that stuff. And I live in Texas. I drive around. None of the streetlights are tuned to reduce waiting times, and reduce traffic, which would reduce emissions.
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now back to the show.
Yeah, at night, I know this technology has been around for at least 50 years. Motion detected lights. You have to leave on thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of lights at night. You can't have motion detectors. Why? So they really care about the environment. Like, no one does a holistic view of everything. Electric cars. I've interviewed people on that. Where is the side-by-side comparison of electric versus gas? All the inputs, all the externalities, everything. And I've been told, never going to see it because it's just never going to get out there. It's never considered in that way. And if it came out that way, the story might be different. That's not what they want to push. So I think there's deliberate and accidental and a whole bunch of other factors why subjects are not covered in this way comprehensively.
Oh, yeah, I completely agree. And listen, I have to agree with that because my main shtick right now is trying to address issues in healthcare. And I cannot sit here and tell you honestly that there are days that I feel like healthcare is an intractable problem. And I'm like, what the hell am I getting myself into? And that's what you're talking about here is an intractable problems. And healthcare is one of them because the people at the top are making tons of money off of it. What is some, jackass like me is going to change that? No, I'm not going to change that. I probably, therefore, am more interested in, kind of focusing on it at a more local level. Well, I can help patients and caregivers at least, but tackling all of healthcare is an intractable problem, which I think is what you're talking about. These are intractable problems.
Well, where and how are you applying this four-dimensional thinking? Like what are you doing where you have, let's say clients that you're consulting with, or, how are you using it?
So I'll give you an example of where I think it applies in some personal ways. So another dimension is zooming in and out. Like I said, I tend to have a more macro, big picture view. I was trained by a demographer. I think I mentioned that I was trained by a demographer. This is like, I love studying what's going on at the population level, okay? And I think that we need to be able to do that. But I would go so far as to say that American individualism has run amok. It is so deeply embedded in our psyche that we don't even consider that there are interesting units of analysis beyond the individual person. And you can see this in the obsession I think we have with concepts like individual liberty. So to relate that to healthcare, one of the main reasons that I've encountered for why people don't want to support some form of social or universal and national healthcare is, well, then I'll lose my individual autonomy to choose my own providers. And I always have two internal reactions, sometimes external reactions when people say that. First of all, okay, dude, there's no way you have chronic disease if that's what you're saying. That doesn't make sense. And secondly, the whole idea of having the freedom to choose your providers is illusory. It doesn't actually exist, but we're just so obsessed with this concept of individual liberty. I think it has gone too far. So an example is I live in one of the fastest growing areas of the country. The numbers prove that. Just tons of people are moving here. It's the eastern shore of Alabama. It's across the bay from Mobile in southern Alabama and the coastal area. And it's very fast, very quickly growing. But it is a demonstrable fact that we do not have the infrastructure. We had a water shortage for several months last year. That's just one of many examples. But you can go driving through here, and within 5 minutes, you're going to see evidence that it's growing because there's always apartment complexes or neighborhoods going up. And for me, who has complex medical care, I've been here for, I think, 3 years, and going on 3 years. My wife and I only have a 1.5-year-old son. And so because I have complex medical needs, I have several different providers. And so, within a few months, I've already been through enough appointments with different providers to start observing that, wow, these doctors' offices are filling up, or wow, I have to schedule so far in advance. And if you just stay at that level, it's really easy to get frustrated and cast a lot of blame on the facilities and the physicians, which I've done that in the past. But if you zoom out a little bit and see, wow, there are actually demographic trends that explain why this is happening, and you have a different understanding of it. And the providers, because I've actually asked every single one of my providers now that I've started connecting these dots, I'm like, hey, are you concerned like me that moving forward, access to healthcare in this area is going to be a problem? Because it terrifies me. I'm at higher risk for stroke as one example. If something like that happens, I need care and I need it now. I'm going to survive, right? And so this is definitely a growing concern for me. And some of them are just point blank, yeah, this is going to be a major issue. My wife and I talked about leaving and moving to a different place because of that. But you can't understand that issue unless you zoom out and look at larger trends. So that's kind of one example, I think, where I can tie to personal things. Does that help kind of shed light on what I'm thinking here?
Yeah, well, in the preamble of the podcast, this has been in my experience. So, I talk to people. My goal is to find the geniuses among them. I would say it's, maybe 1 in 100, sometimes less. And I've realized different people have different problems. So in any industry, 95% of the people, these are my numbers, are good enough to be licensed. 5% are really good. And 0.1%, I know it doesn't add to 100, but it's close, are truly exceptional. So if you have a problem, a commonplace problem, you can be serviced by most people that do that. Plumbing, right, healthcare, whatever it is. If you have a 0.1% problem, by definition, you're going to have to go through a lot of providers in order to find the one that can actually help you. Yeah, that's what I realized. So maybe that's some guidance for what you're going through is unfortunately, you should expect to have to go through a lot of people to find the gems that can actually really help you at the level you need.
Yeah, to some degree, sure, that's going to be the case. But I know people who live in certain places and they have complex needs like I do. I just had a conversation earlier today with someone who has MS, and he lives in a place where apparently everything is there that he needs, and the health insurance access is awesome, and it's a community that provides for those needs. So we have these pockets of examples where, okay, this is working at the local level. Does anyone ever think about what if this happened at a larger scale kind of thing? So you are correct in making that observation, but there are places where I guess we have to call them exceptional.
Well, you also have to look at the incentives of who you're dealing with, Yeah. Are they incentivized to make this healthcare more accessible, or do they do better financially by just charging, much more than they normally could because it's inaccessible, because everyone's desperate for it? Maybe that's their model. And therefore, what you're trying to do, they go counter to what's in the purse. They don't want to do that. So there's a lot of levels of analysis I'm just starting to see based on what you're saying, that you need to look at things to really get the outcome you want. And very few people are going to be able to go that deep or consider things like that,
Yeah, I agree.
Now, I'm not saying because people are stupid. It's just because it takes a lot of practice to even think like this and then to implement it consciously when you're faced with a situation that maybe mixes in personal fear and apprehension and all that. I would guess it makes it hard to think,
Yes, for sure. And I've kind of just compiled these over several years. So I agree with you. And I don't always hit the right audience with this, because when it gets down to it, I have learned really good strategies from being a patient and from being a caregiver of just how to interact with physicians and what strategies to take and how to understand insurance and what it means and to make sure that you can squeeze more juice out of your healthcare. And that's one of the things you asked earlier, how does this manifest in me serving people? And one of the things that I like doing is helping people navigate their own medical needs more. And I just have to accept in that particular context that they're not going to give a damn about these higher order thinking processes. They're like, I just don't feel well. I'm so burnt out by caring for my mother with dementia. I just need some strategies. And sometimes, functionally speaking, that's where they are. And that's where we have to meet them. As a social worker, it's all about meet them where they are. And that's where I have to meet them. I completely 100% agree with you. I accept that this is not always functional, but there are other audiences where I do think there are functional purposes too, where we have to be addressing these higher order issues. It just depends, part of it depends on the audience.
Yeah, but there's also thinking systems that may be of use, like TRIZ. This guy, Generic Altschuler, worked in a patent office and studied, supposedly over thousands of patents, what the successful ones had in common. So this is more for engineering. But he'll say like, okay, if you have a process, what if you take out a step? What if you add in a step? What if you reverse the order? What if you run it colder, hotter, faster, in a different oxygen environment? There's all these permutations you could do. He has a list of like 100 of them that you could apply to a system. And a lot of times that'll reveal new things. So there's multiple thinking systems like this that I've seen that, you and other people can use. Brainstorming sessions, certain guided ones. There's just a whole bunch that I run into that I think can help you think through complex things. It gives you tools on how to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And systems theory in the social sciences is a common one. And I would say that, that's valuable. I don't think that I would say that it doesn't have all the dimensions here, but it is very useful. And I like a lot. My original love is biology. And there are a lot of days where I just wish that I had leaned into that. That's what I've studied in undergrad. I love just reading about evolution and animal behavior. I'm an amateur bird watcher because that's like a way to scratch that itch. And there are many days where I wish that I had just gone into all biology. I'm a PhD in ecology or something like that. And I'll really appreciate how ecological theories and models have increasingly been applied to the social sciences. So for sure, there are these different models that I think can have a lot of use. And I think my prediction is that we'll increasingly see some of the ones that are developed by engineers or the natural sciences. Let's see if we can apply this to social situations. We've already seen some of that, and I think it's going to be more and more, which is really interesting. And at some point, one's going to really click and work very well.
Yeah, you said you're studying theology. So from a theological perspective, is there anything that you can bring to bear on the access to healthcare problem? From a theological perspective, it sounds way out there, but it might give you a radically different view. A friend of mine, mentor, he studied what's called strategic culture. Like, let's say you're a doctor. How were you trained? What was expected of you? How did the environment shape you in your training and all that to make you who you are today? Versus a policeman, versus a drug dealer, versus a whatever. An insurance salesman. So there's a lot of different angles that can be brought to bear to analyze situations. There's probably like tons of them. So maybe that would help with multidimensional thinking. I don't know.
I would argue that it's simultaneously way out there and deep within, which makes it, I think theologians could possibly have a really valuable role to play. A couple of examples are this, just to try to make it more practical. Because I want to make sure that you're bringing up some excellent points. Like, I don't want to just, have my ass in the clouds staring at my navel the whole time. I can provide some practical applications. One is, as a gerontologist, I also have to account for dying and death because most people die in older age. And so there's a lot of overlap with studying aging and studying end of life. And it doesn't matter what my beliefs are, anyone's beliefs, and whether you're religious or not. The bottom line is a lot of these metaphysical or spiritual questions come to the fore at the end of life. There's a lot of why asked at that time. And I think that people who are on the front lines of healthcare, and especially surely a hospice and palliative care, they need to have the basic skills of embracing that those conversations are going to happen. And to give another example, I'm in Alabama, but I lived in Georgia before this. And there's this I think it's a cool initiative. It's the Georgia Rural Health Innovation Center. And what they do specifically, they work in rural areas and with physicians and healthcare providers in those rural areas, because unlike in medium to larger size cities where you have enough people to justify having specialists for each kind of condition and whatnot, rural physicians perform a wide array of roles. And kind of the whole point of the Georgia Rural Health Center is let's get faith leaders working alongside these rural physicians, because that's a different kind of dynamic than a place that has, like a larger city. And I think that's really fascinating and a good role because, physicians may not have the training on what do you do at the bedside when someone has these kind of higher order questions or whatever you want to call them. So those are a couple of practical examples where I think theology does have a lot of function if we could realize it. Even with mass secularization, I still make that point.
Yeah, I mean, there's tons of ways to look at things. One way would maybe be, you can't be that much of a Renaissance man, almost no one can, is you build a team of advisors,
Yep.
Someone that's in theology, someone that's in healthcare, or someone that's a doctor, someone that's a patient. Then all their perspectives, even if you get only one perspective from each of them, at least if you do a brainstorming session, they can all come together and form what you're doing.
Yeah, I actually thought on mentioning that earlier, and I ended up going off on down a different road, because you're going to have experts, and we should have experts, but multidisciplinary teams. And we see it to some degree within a certain hospital ward or within a certain medical facility with teams of physicians, social workers, and nurses, et cetera. You have these multidisciplinary teams, and I think that they generally work too well. But there are two gaps where I think we need to improve. One is within those teams, and this is not the case, it's not universally true. I just think that it's generally true. So as a social worker, I also interact with and serve social workers, and there's a lot of frustration because someone like that is contributing just as much to these teams, but they're just not valued as much as, say, physicians and nurses. I think that's a problem, and it's because we rely very heavily on medical perspectives of health and much less on other perspectives. I think that's a mistake. And then externally, what's really frustrating to me, and I think it's a lot of people with chronic disease and, have to deal with healthcare would agree with me here, but why are these interdisciplinary teams not interacting with other interdisciplinary teams? My cardiologist and my neurologist, my colorectal surgeon, there should be a better system in place for them to have conversations with one another. But once we get to that conversation, that just takes us back to the point that you and I were talking about earlier about it being an intractable problem. Who has the incentive to make it that way? It's two different kinds of issues.
Well, what have you been doing with for your success? If you're doing consulting or at least with your own healthcare, like what are the, I'm throwing all this stuff at you that I've learned over the years, but what techniques or tips help you?
Yeah, I think some of the soft skills, I guess we could call them that. If you're on the job hunt, they're often called soft skills of like assertiveness and self-advocacy, because I think a lot of people just have an inherent trust of, or maybe even a fear of physicians, and they may have other questions online, but they just don't ask them. Like my mom and other people, I regularly tell them, like, I just had this interaction with my doctor. They're like, wow, you said that to him? I'm like, yeah, you're damn right. This is what I need. I just, at the individual level.
It's your life. It's no big deal. Just kidding.
I agree with that, but I'm telling you that a lot of people just, I don't think that they do enough to squeeze juice out of their healthcare. There's a lot more that they can be doing. And so that's kind of one side of it. And I'm on the earlier side. I'll be honest about that, because I was recently a professor, and there were some things I did in the classroom. I'm like, you know what? University students aren't the only ones who need to be hearing this. And that was more on the public health, global health side. And so I'm on the earlier stage of, I want to get more speaking gigs and talk about some of these issues with health and healthcare to larger audiences. I would love for providers to be in that audience, but that might take a little bit longer. That can be a very insular community. But I've had a lot of early good returns being a professor and doing various presentations and lectures on these topics. I don't really have to sell these points to social workers and public health people because they're already largely thinking, at least in some of these ways. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. Well, what problem in particular are you most focused on? Is it access to healthcare for certain conditions? Like, what are you putting all your effort into right now, or most of your effort?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say chronic disease and chronic pain more generally. I have wondered if maybe I should just lean in on heart disease specifically. I mean, it is the leading killer in most populations in the world. I think it's a 1 in 5 chance of dying of heart disease here in the U.S. I have a much higher chance than that, of course. But I call myself, I identify as a chronic disease advocate. So I would say chronic issues in general and chronic pain. I haven't said much about that, but I think that's part of it. And I just try to make these issues come more to the forefront. I can't screen share, obviously. I don't know if you've ever encountered the power wheel of privilege. Are you familiar with that concept? No. Okay. It's like it's a wheel, and there are different axes, spokes coming out, and each of those spokes is a vulnerable population, right? And so the ones at the center are the most powerful, and so it's white, straight men, able-bodied, living in urban areas, Protestant, etc. And then as you go out, you have the vulnerable populations based on age, race, sex, disability, etc. And I never see them with spokes for chronic disease and chronic pain. And I think that there should be some. It is technically true that I am protected with having heart disease, that is included on the list of the ADA protected things, and that's great. But there are a lot of experiences people with chronic disease and chronic pain have that don't have overlap with disability. And so I just think that it needs to be more normalized. And that's kind of my thing right now. I want to make it more normalized. It's why I'm very open sharing about my own experiences, because if other people also want to be open about it, then they should. But there are so many issues with people. I just spoke to someone earlier who got fired because of his disability and access to various types of services. It just doesn't have to be that way. So that's what I'm focused on right now. And I have wondered if maybe I should just lean in completely on heart disease. I haven't reached that point yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if I end up going that way.
Yeah, I would say the more that you niche down, the less tentacles the problem will have, and the more likely you are to at least solve part of it. But,
Yeah, I guess maybe I'm not conveying myself well. I certainly do not suggest that I alone can, I don't have that aspiration. I hope that I can encourage a few more people to see things a little bit more widely than they're typically doing. And I don't think that it's encouraged because of our cultural values, like I said, of individual liberty and American individualism. But I mean, you are right. We have to have groups of people who each have their own expertise. I may have not conveyed that very well, but I do agree
All
with
right.
that point.
Well, I mean, I guess one final thing, we could just keep throwing these things at you, but I found the 80-20 rule to be incredibly useful. It's a great Occam's razor to cut away, a lot of the garbage in a problem. It gets in the heart of what's going on. So, like this fourth dimensional thinking. Let's say there's 10 different ways to do it. Well, what's likely to happen is 2 or 3 of the ways are going to be predominant that would get people 80% better solution. Not 100%, but again, I'm a lot further along. So focusing on those few, identifying and focusing on those few in the context of access to certain kinds of healthcare, let's say for heart conditions, that may be a way to reduce the workload and it's less overwhelming that way. Just solve a little piece of the problem, a very specific piece, but one that's predominant. You can't, if you can't analyze the problem along 10 different axes, what are the top 3 to do it along? And at least you're better off than people that just do it one dimension.
Yes, for sure. I think that's a great way of putting it. And I would argue that we're more likely to find those solutions if we just allow ourselves, even just a little bit, to go beyond our own perspective. I mean, really, when it gets down to it, this is what the definition of empathy is. And I probably would say that we need more of that in our society right now, not just with healthcare, with all kinds of issues. But that's basically what it is. Are you capable of seeing something from someone else's perspective, not agreeing with it, but just seeing it from someone else's perspective? And I personally believe, I'm convicted that if I won't say everyone, that's not realistic. If more people did it just a little bit, then we're more likely to find those 2 or 3 solutions that are going to work really, really well. But I think there's a lot that's missing in the haystack because we're not squeezing all the juice that we can out of our abilities to reflect on these issues.
I think a big problem, I'm seeing the degradation of everything, service, care, morals, all that stuff. I think my guess is a lot of people think no one seems to care about me. Why should I care about anyone else? I think a lot of people are very demoralized at everything that's been going on, especially the past 4 years, since all the COVID crap started. That's just the feeling I get from just interacting with people all over the place. So it makes it even harder. They're less likely to think outside of themselves and their immediate need because, again, my guess is, like I said, most people feel like the world doesn't care about them. The government doesn't care about them. The city they live in doesn't care about them. No one does. All they want is money and fealty and all this other stuff out of people, and who cares? That's it,
Yeah, I feel that way. That's what I meant when I said that push has come to shove. I feel that alongside them, and it is incredibly demoralizing. And like I said, I have many moments I'm like, God, this is just a massive problem. And I have to realize that I'm going to wake up the next day and maybe I don't feel quite that much. So like, okay, then I'll be productive again and try to do something about it. But absolutely, I am one of those who feels demoralized. I think to some degree that brings us to the question of, okay, obviously there's no point in me having this full discussion with, again, like go back to what I said earlier, with patients and caregivers, because they just have these immediate needs. That's what they care about. They're interested in their own health and well-being. That's fine. I have no issue with that. Who should be having these conversations? It's the people who cause those issues, the causes of the demoralization in the first place. Like it's the root of those symptoms. If it just get through to politicians, I don't know, because they're just in the pockets of corporate folks and whatever. That's a whole different discussion. I'm just letting you know that I recognize what you say, and I do agree with that.
I think the great writer and thinker, Thomas Sowell, he's like 93 now. He's written like 35 books or something. He gave an example. He's like, if I talk to a mob boss, I tell him, you really shouldn't commit crime. It's not good. His answer was the mob boss would say, I make 100 times what you'd ever make. Get away from me. Why do I care? I care about what I get from me. So how do you appeal to those people that they just don't have anyone else's interest at heart? They have money, power, self-aggrandizement, whatever it is at heart. How do you get to those people? If that's what you're dealing with.
Yeah, absolutely. And it may very well be the case that in asking these questions and doing our best to stumble to an answer to those questions, the conclusion that we come to is that these people in power cannot be gotten to. Maybe that truly is the epitome of an intractable problem. And if that's the case, then that doesn't change the fact that people living these lives on the ground still want and need help. And so at that point, okay, where does it make most practical sense to step in and start kind of applying some of these principles? Clearly, it's not going to work at the top. And quite frankly, I would probably say that that's true. But there's
at a local level. And then
I mean, to some degree, the local level, we still have to realize, though, that there is a trickle-down effect. I personally believe that there is some difference that we can make in some parts of the macro. I don't know. It depends on the issue, right? It does depend on the issue. I mean, we can look at seatbelt laws. That had to be a law instigated, I think, first by the federal government, and a lot of people probably still would not be wearing their seatbelts without that law. The way that finally, it took a long time because the tobacco industry was really, really powerful, but finally it made an inroads through lawsuits and whatnot, and now, the Surgeon General's warning was on there, and finally, after several decades, the lung cancer rates did decline, and these are problems that have been addressed at the macro level. So actually, I think there is some hope at certain levels of the macro, even if there's not at the very top. And I guess I would say that if there's something we can do, then we at least owe it to ourselves to have a discussion about where does it make most sense to step in. Hopefully I'm being clear there.
No, I understand. I mean, look, you could see the evil side of it. I consider it, in my own words, but look at COVID. Look at all the garbage they forced upon everybody. When they want to do it, they can. No problem. It's just the incentives have to be there for the people in power. More money, more power, great. We'll force the people to stand on one leg and, do this, that, or the other. They don't care. So when they want to, they can get it done easily. They just don't want it. It doesn't appeal to them.
I just want to be clear here. When you say it doesn't appeal to them, who's them?
The higher ups, the people that run our health industry, the people that run the laws that govern insurance. We're just talking about healthcare. The people that decide what the standard of care is, all that stuff.
Okay.
They have no interest in any of this stuff. They're just trying to maximize their profits. I don't think they care at all about helping anybody. That's not what they're there to do. Like, I get normal health care. You go to your doctor's not even allowed to say certain things or prescribe certain things. They have to follow what's called the standard of care.
Yep.
Then you have insurance layered in on top of that. What does insurance know about health care? Nothing.
Exactly. Yeah.
They're the ones that are saying what can and can't be done for you to get help at a doctor. So what chance do most people have of getting any kind of help? I would say very little because of that. If you're on insurance, if you cash pay, which a lot of people can't afford, you have more freedom. But even then, so the whole system is just a mess, total mess from what I've encountered, and I haven't encountered nearly as much as you have.
How would you, I don't disagree with any of that. How would you frame things like Obamacare is a really complex issue, and I'm not saying all of it's good, but I'll tell you the one part that sticks out to me is that I have been denied health coverage in the past. This is before I even had health insurance because I had a diagnosable condition that one day could turn into an issue. And it was the same policy. My mom has the same problem. I got it from her. And it was the same company that she had a policy through. And she actually called them up and said, listen, this doesn't make sense. I have this insurance. Jacob should have it as well. But one thing that I really appreciate about the ACA, Obamacare, is that it's much more protective of people with pre-existing conditions. So I don't want to get here into a rabbit hole of overall Obamacare, but at least specific things like we have made progress. How do you frame those kind of macro level things of decisions that were made by politicians and were not necessarily to the benefit of corporations? Where does that come into the points that you're making? I'm asking genuinely.
Well, not even corporations. I just give you a quick example. Obamacare didn't help me. I went on their system. They offered me a policy at 60% coverage with a $25,000 deductible, and it was $2,000 a month for me and my family. Utter garbage. So I just paid a penalty. Thank God it went away after a few years, but it's useless to me. How am I supposed to afford a $25,000 deductible and then 60% coverage? It was a joke, but they try to force it down everyone's throat. I'm sure a lot of other people maybe got better plans than I did, but mine was totally worthless. I couldn't do it. Just couldn't afford it. It was totally useless. I tried to afford it, So how's that help anyone? So they're not looking at this. They're like, we'll help maybe this one kind of person who is, and then everyone else, who cares? That it wasn't, from what I could see, there wasn't much thought put into it. It was this all big fanfare. They pushed it through, and it was just a nightmare, a total mess. I put my information into healthcare.gov. The site got hacked, and my information got stolen. You think anyone cares? It does anything? Any compensation for victims? No, they don't care. And the website itself, it cost $700 million to make it, and then it was broken, of course. And then they spent another $300-400 million to fix it. So it was over $1 billion to do the site, which was utter garbage. And I have programmers. I could have done that site for $20,000. Easy. So where did all that money go? It was just stolen. So I just see, unfortunately, and just mass corruption. So that makes it even harder to get anything done. Then these things, you're right, they're not thought through at all. They may have a few great talking points that get some people to vote for it, and then whatever the other consequences are, who cares? So it's like one step forward, 4 steps back for certain people. So
yeah, I may have not used the best example. I guess I was just basically getting at that we have seen examples where something is enacted beyond the local level, and some of those things end up having a positive effect. Not necessarily on everyone. I'm just saying that there is something going on at the macro level. And I mean, we had progressed in some ways. So I agree with you that focusing on the local level definitely is going to be important. I just think that we still need to be willing to think more outside the box. We just enjoy putting things in boxes, and maybe there's a better way of conceptualizing things.
Yeah.
I think there is. I just don't think people are doing it for various reasons.
Yeah.
It's like Sinclair said something like, I'm paraphrasing, if a man's job depends on him not understanding an issue or caring, he's not going to care. It's very loose paraphrase, but it's right. I'd have to look up the quote. So I think a lot of these people, positions that make these decisions and craft policy, how are they incentivized? I would think that's an incredibly powerful thing that will tell you what's going to come out of it. And if they're incentivized the wrong way, where you've got a lot of stuff just baked in, how are you ever going to get a good outcome for people? It'll be like by accident. Or maybe the group that, complains the loudest, maybe they'll be listened to. But it's hard. It's hard to address everyone's concerns. It's impossible to address everyone's concerns. So what do you do then? You 80-20 in and take the people with the most dire concerns. You take the people that are the most disenfranchised and address their concerns. Like it just seems like a very, very difficult thing to do, even if you wanted to do it the right way.
Yeah, for sure. And back to my question earlier about who you're referring to with them, I'm not even sure it's the politicians. They're in other people's pockets. I tend to have a bit of an oligarchical view of who has the power here right now. But them is someone. And you are right that whoever it is, they don't have the incentive to solve these problems. I guess one of the questions I have is, if we could take the people at the top, and I think it's mostly the billionaires, and go down from there to find someone where we could make a difference, what is the fewest number of steps we can take from the top? And would it be worthwhile to target things at that level? I don't know what that level is, and I don't know the answer to that question. But that is one kind of reflection that I'm having right now. I definitely don't think there's any point in trying to address the people at the top because, they're spending millions of dollars to go to space. Well, they clearly don't care and they're not going to. But someone at some point down the chain does care. I don't know if that's more state politicians. I don't know. I don't know who it is, but I do believe that one good way of looking at it is let's take a backward step from the top. What's the fewest number of steps we got to take down before, okay, this makes sense to maybe do something at this level?
Yeah, I would say start at the individual level of the patient, go up one level to the doctor, go up one more level, and you'll soon see where it seems to break down. I would guess going that way instead of, like you said, going to the top's useless probably. So maybe going bottom up, like you just said, would be it. And each stage you evaluate, and does this person have the authority to actually make change or at least speak to the change makers? Do I have to go one more level up? Oh, have we run into a wall now where this person's job depends all on politics? So we're not going to get anywhere at this point. Maybe that's the way to do it.
I would say both. Let's analyze it in both directions and see what we come up with. Maybe it'll end up at the same place. Maybe it won't. I just like the idea of analyzing things from not just one way. I agree with you, and that's how I often do it at the individual level. If I call an insurance company and they're frustrating me, I'm like, okay, let me talk to your supervisor, and they'll usually let me. I think in the near future, I'm going to push it beyond that point. I'm going to keep going up, and yeah, you're eventually going to hit a wall. But let's also analyze it the other way. And there are probably some other ways out there that I haven't even mentioned. I'm sure that there are. I would say let's do each of them and see what we come up with. Just see. I mean, we don't know, right? We don't know until we've done it. And maybe someone else done it. I'm just mentioning it, one kind of example. But let's do it both ways.
Yeah. I think in general, it needs to be people that are able to consider things beyond their own immediate need. I'm saying able to because some people I understand they can't. They're in really bad shape.
Yeah, they can't.
They got to just focus on themselves, which is okay. Yeah. But whoever is capable of doing that would be the people that you could, bring in to help you and try to get a toehold here and figure out what to do. Yeah. So, the system is so vast. And so I wouldn't even know where to start. Some of the things we talked about, some of the prompts, I guess, would be a good way to start.
I think what you just said is probably an interesting connecting point with the theology as well, because I think a lot of the people who actually do care are not in positions of power. They're just kind of wrestling in the mud at the grassroots level, and they're doing really cool things, at least locally. I sometimes imagine, man, what if a person like that had power? Maybe power corrupts, or maybe just those people are attracted to those roles. I'm not sure. I know that there are good people out there who care. I wish more of those people were capable of making wide-scale decisions.
Very good. Well, I think it's been a really good conversation. Sorry if I get a little bit intense there, but my emotions are in this too. I'm with you. I believe you.
No way. Yeah, I love the conversation. I appreciate you throwing me some good pitches. Thanks for that.
Yeah. Well, what are resources for people that are listening? How can they, if you want them to, get in touch with you and get into this expanded thinking? Let's say someone that has the same passion that you have, they want to, provide expanded access to healthcare. Like, how can they reach out?
Yeah, appreciate you asking. My main hub is LinkedIn. I've been wondering if that is the best place, but it is for now where I am. You can access my website and other services on there. My website is jacobevanskendall.com. That's pretty easy, but that's also, you can access that through my LinkedIn page, which is LinkedIn at whatever, Jacob Evans Kendall. Yeah.
Okay, very good. Well, Jacob, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. It's been a really good call. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I enjoyed the conversation.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.